Good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Please welcome your MC for this afternoon. Veuillez accueillir votre MC, Jasmine Berriot.
Hi, everyone. I'm a board member with CAH, and I'm from Saskatchewan and a member of Cowessess First Nation. CAH 24 and every national conference on ending homelessness would not be possible without the support of our sponsors. You will have seen their names up on a screen and throughout the conference. Putting on a conference of this size and scale costs more money than we can bring in through registration. We couldn't bring everyone together here in Ottawa without the support of our sponsors. I'd like to welcome Shane Peltier, Executive Director of the National Indigenous Homelessness Council, to the stage to introduce our keynote speaker.
Hi, everyone. Before we get to the introduction, we've been out with our booth asking you all to sign up for a chance to win our gift baskets, and so we're going to give those away now. So if you're outside and you signed up for a gift basket, come on in, and we're going to draw names here from our Halloween basket. Tim Richter. No, just kidding. Natasha Hanley. Is Natasha Hanley in the room? You're going to have to scream or jump up in the air because I can't see you. Oh. Natasha Hanley.
Oh, they said, it looks like they're pointing to someone right out the door.
Okay.
They're coming.
I don't know.
Well,
This. Taylor Adair. Sorry. Taylor? Sounds like, yeah, Taylor's over there. Nope. The next basket is Ashley Grant. Ashley Grant?
oh,
She's over there, all right. This is great. Grace Kumba? I think I'm hearing clapping from the back there. Yeah, Grace is here. Grace is going to come up.
great, that's four.
Did the first person?
Was Natasha Hanley.
Did we get one to Natasha Hanley? I think we did. Oh, you're Natasha? Okay. Yeah, we got Natasha. Okay. And the last one goes to...
That was four.
Yeah.
We found Natasha.
Okay. Okay. Maria Rodrigo, BC Housing. And I think she's in the room. Okay. That's great. Thanks everybody who came and visited our booth. If you want to follow us, we are on social media, and we have a website at www.nihc.ca, and we're going to be building a newsletter. So please come visit our website and our socials and follow us for more information on the National Indigenous Homelessness Council. Today I have the great privilege of introducing Connie Walker, a trailblazing Cree journalist from Okanese First Nation in Saskatchewan. Connie's work confronts some of the most painful yet crucial aspects of our shared history in Canada. Through her acclaimed investigative storytelling in podcasts like Missing and Murdered and Stolen, Connie sheds light on deeply personal impacts of colonization, uncovering stories of intergenerational trauma, resilience, and the ongoing journey towards reconciliation. Her award-winning series, Stolen, Surviving St. Michael's, which examines her own father's experience in the residential school, won both a Pulitzer Prize and Peabody Award for its compassionate truth-telling approach. Connie's work holds up a mirror to our own roles in this history, inviting us to truly see, understand, and acknowledge the lived realities of Indigenous peoples. Her storytelling offers a safe space, one that challenges us to engage with empathy and reminds us of the power of bearing witness. In this plenary, we are in for a moving, thought-provoking reflection on the role of journalism in creating a more just and inclusive Canada. Please join me in welcoming Connie Walker.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Shane, for that very kind introduction. I'm so glad and grateful to join you all today. I want to thank you for the invitation. I feel like there are so many similarities in terms of the work that we're all doing in our various fields, and I'm really glad to be able to be here today. I want to thank you, the elders for providing the support. Some of the work that I do and some of what I'll be talking about today does deal with some difficult subject matter, so I'm so glad to know that there's support available here for people who need it, and so please to take care while you're listening. I want to start off with a bit of an introduction for those of you who don't know me. My name is Connie Walker. I'm a member of the Okanese First Nation in Treaty 4 territory in Saskatchewan. And like many people from Treaty 4, I come from a very, very large Cree family. And I want to acknowledge them here today because they are my biggest source of support, but also my family and my community are my biggest motivation as well. I've been a journalist for over 20 years, and for most of the last decade, I've been able to focus almost exclusively on reporting on Indigenous communities, primarily in podcasting, audio storytelling, long-form, investigative, narrative podcasts, each one of them a deep dive into the life of an Indigenous person, a chance to meet Cleo, Alberta, Jermaine, and to hear from their families and immerse ourselves in their communities. We want to try to help people understand who they were, but also the realities that Indigenous people live in Canada and the US. Our podcasts have been downloaded millions of times by listeners around the world. We've won major journalism awards in Canada and the United States and have been featured in The New Yorker, The New York Times, Rolling Stone, Vanity Fair, and Vogue. But I want to start off today by telling you all about the first time that I thought about becoming a journalist. I remember I was in grade 12 when I first learned about Pamela George. Pamela George was a 28-year-old Saulteaux mother of two. She was a daughter, a sister, a cousin, an auntie. I didn't know Pamela, but she was from the Sakamay First Nation, which is not far from where I grew up, just across the valley. I remember going to Sakamay to the powwows there with my grandma when I was a little kid. Pamela lived in Regina with her young children when she was killed in 1995. She was beaten and left on a rural road outside of the city one night in April. The two men who were charged in her death didn't go on trial until late the next year. Now, in spite of what my job ended up becoming and what my life is now, I'll be honest with you all, I wasn't a teenager who paid much attention to the news. But I think every Indigenous woman and girl and every First Nations person really in Saskatchewan knew about Pamela. It was a high-profile trial that dominated headlines in the province, but also made national news. And as a young First Nations woman, I was keenly aware of the way that Pamela was spoken about in the media and how it differed from the way the two white men who were on trial were described. I want to play a clip from then so you can all understand what I'm talking about. This is from the National on December 19th, 1996.
In Regina, a jury is deciding the fate of two young men charged with the murder of a young woman. It's a case a lot of people are watching closely, and the CBC's Eric Sorensen tells us why.
The accused are young and clean-cut. Steve Comerfield, a basketball star. Alex Ternowetsky, a hockey standout. They come from middle-class families. The victim was Aboriginal and a prostitute. The two men admit they were cruising Regina's streets one night last year looking for a hooker. In this area known for prostitutes, they admitted picking up Pamela George, taking her to a remote roadside, beating her, and leaving her behind. Her body was found the next morning by police. In court, a friend of the accused testified that Comerfield told him, "We drove around, got drunk, and killed this chick." And that Ternowetsky told him she deserved it. She was Indian. The accused denied making those comments. They also testified they didn't hit Pamela George that hard.
It wasn't just the CBC. Newspaper headlines called Pamela, quote, a prostitute, but didn't say much else about her life. I felt like I knew more about the two men who were charged with her murder than I did about Pamela. Stephen Comerfield, the basketball star, and Alex Ternowetsky, the hockey standout, were acquitted of first-degree murder and sentenced to manslaughter in Pamela's death. And at the time, I remember wondering if there were any First Nations journalists who were in the newsrooms that were covering the trial. And it was the first time that I thought about becoming a journalist. I wrote something for our high school newsletter. I wanted to help people better understand Pamela, but really all First Nations, to learn about our people, our families, and our communities, to create space so that people could have empathy for a young single mother who struggled to raise a family. I don't think I had the words, honestly, at the time to understand necessarily, but I knew innately that if they said that about Pamela, they could say that about me, and my aunties and my cousins. Ternowetsky and Comerfield both served around 4 years of jail time before they were released on bail, around the time that I started at the CBC as an intern. A few years later, I was working on a national news program in Toronto when a young woman who I knew from back home went missing. This was before social media, before Facebook or Twitter, when her family sent an email chain with her picture and asked people to forward it to their address books. It was their way of trying to raise awareness about the disappearance of Amber Redman. I knew Amber because I coached her when I was in university. She was the same age as my sister, and my cousin Shelley and I coached the volleyball team from our tribal council at the Saskatchewan Indian Winter Games, and Amber was one of our girls one year. That summer, another young woman went missing in Toronto. Her name is Alicia Ross. Amber and Alicia went missing within 1 month of each other in the summer of 2005. I remember thinking there were so many similarities between them. Both these young, bright, beautiful women who had their futures ahead of them. Both had families who were just desperate for any information about their disappearances. But there were some key differences. Alicia was white and blonde, and her disappearance was covered in the national newspapers and on national newscasts. And Amber's disappearance barely got any local coverage. At the time, I was working for a program, and part of our mandate was actually to examine the role of media. So I wanted to pitch a story that compared and contrasted the way these two cases were being handled. I thought my story would be a perfect fit for our show, and I went in to pitch my boss. But before I could even begin, she held up her hand and said, "This isn't another poor Indian story, is it?" At the time, I was the only Indigenous person in my newsroom. Actually, 95% of my career, I've been the only Indigenous person in my newsroom. And then I didn't feel like there was anywhere to turn to for support, so I held my tongue. And looking back on it now, I'm honestly horrified by the attitudes that Indigenous journalists faced back then. The microaggressions, the straight up racism sometimes that led to this false belief that our stories weren't important, that Canadians didn't care, that our history, our truths, and that we didn't matter. Thankfully, so much of that has changed. I was able to join a chorus of Indigenous journalists across CBC, but really across journalism and across the country, to push for change. And we found so many allies, people like yourselves, who helped amplify our voices. I can point to many, many stories and many moments over the last several years that really kind of helped turn that tide and helped shift the conversation, including the documentary series, Eighth Fire, Idle No More, you all remember that, CBC Aboriginal. But one of the most important stories, I think, that really helped shift this conversation was the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the testimonies of survivors of the Indian residential school system. I remember in 2015, I was at the final, actually, in 2014, 1 year before the final event of the TRC, I was covering a story for CBC Aboriginal, and I was filing for the National that night, and I remember calling the assignment desk and talking to the assignment producer to vet my script. And he said, oh wait, we're actually gonna hold your story until tomorrow because we already have another Indigenous story. And the idea was that you couldn't have two, you can't have two in one newscast, you know? And honestly, at the time I was mostly relieved because I wanted more time to work on my script. And so I was like, okay, whatever. But exactly a year later, I was back here in Ottawa covering the final event of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The TRC coverage led the National for 5 days in a row that week. And on the day that the final report was released, the first 15 minutes of the entire show was all TRC coverage. That's how quickly things changed in a year. And I remember at the final event, Truth and Reconciliation Commissioner Justice Murray Sinclair told a room like this one, packed with survivors and intergenerational survivors and their families and media, that there's not a single Indigenous person in Canada who has not been touched by the legacy of residential schools. When he said that, I believed it. As soon as he said it, I feel like I knew it in a way, having grown up in my community, on my reserve. But it really wasn't, actually that day made me think. It was one of the biggest days of my career. I was filing the lead story for the National, the TRC's coverage. Final event was the lead story that day, but it was also one of the most difficult days in my career. Because although I grew up in a very close-knit Cree family, it wasn't until I was a student in university that I started connecting the dots back to the legacies of residential school in my own family. I remember I took an Indian Studies class, we used to call it Indian Studies back then, at SIFC, and it was focused on oral history. And one of our assignments was to interview someone to record their oral history. And I decided to interview my grandfather, my late grandfather, Harry Bellegarde. I was very close to both of my grandparents, Harry Bellegarde and Margaret Walker, my whole life. They helped raise me. And I lived with them often throughout my career, and especially my grandfather and I spent a lot of time together because he would be the person who would come and pick me up after volleyball practice or baseball practice. And when I got old enough to drive, I would drive him around to garage sales on Saturday mornings. So I spent a lot of time in the car with my grandpa, and I really remember feeling like I knew him really well. But it wasn't until I was interviewing him for this podcast, for that assignment, that I found out for the first time that he was sent to a residential school when he was 6 years old. He didn't say much about his experience, except for one story. He said that as a boy, before he was taken away, he was really close to his grandfather, that they were always together. He told me a story actually about, going with his grandpa when he went to play cards and how he would play into the night and my grandpa would fall asleep under his chair while his grandpa was playing cards. But sometime after he was sent to residential school, his grandfather passed away and my grandpa wasn't allowed to go home for his funeral. And he told me he remembered crying underneath a stairwell at the school. And I thought of my grandfather that day in Ottawa, and my grandmother, also a residential school survivor. I never talked to her about her experience either, but after she passed, I learned that she was sent to a residential school in Manitoba, the Birtle residential school, and that she and a friend ran away from the residential school, and they were, two of the lucky ones who made it home. And she never went to school after that, and she was also adamant that her children would not go to residential school. It was difficult to maintain my composure that day in Ottawa, but I was grateful to be covering this final event of the TRC. I knew somehow that my lived experiences as a Cree woman allowed me to provide some of the context needed to understand the impact of that day. And it also sparked within me an aspiration to keep pushing, to find a way to ensure that the space that the work of the TRC created to help tell stories about Indigenous people in our communities could continue. I wanted to help deepen our understanding about how those legacies of residential schools were continuing to impact our families and our communities. In particular, the TRC final report linked the legacies of residential schools and the crisis of violence that Indigenous women and girls face in Canada today. Missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls has been a critical issue in our communities for decades, but it took until 2015 for us to be given the space and support to properly cover it. That year, we launched a database of unsolved cases of MMIWG in Canada. We interviewed 111 family members and helped tell their loved ones' stories. Our goal was to raise awareness about the issue, the crisis of violence, but in a way that didn't only focus on the violence that resulted in their death or disappearance. We wanted to show that, like Pamela George, every single woman and girl had a family that loved and missed them. Amber Tuckerow went missing in 2010 from Nisku, Alberta.
I used to always tell them.
I'm just gonna. She's at the top there with the National under. We filed a story about Amber's disappearance for the National. And I interviewed her mother, Tootsie Tuckerow, and I just want to play a clip from that interview for you all today.
I used to always tell Amber, like, don't hitchhike, don't go with strangers, or if you're in a cab, even if you have to pretend like you're on your cell phone, like, do it just so the person will think you're talking to somebody and won't do nothing to you.
Tootsie doesn't know how or why, but the night before they were due to head back home, Amber ended up in the exact situation her mother warned her about. She got in a vehicle with an unknown man, but this phone call wasn't fake. It was real.
Yo, where are we going?
And it was being recorded on the other end.
You better not be taking me anywhere I don't want to go. I want to go into the city. Jeez.
Amber was never heard from again. Tootsie reported her missing right away, but says police didn't take Amber's disappearance seriously.
Oh, she's probably out partying and she'll come home, she'll call. That's what they told me, but I said I still won't report her missing.
RCMP didn't seem to put much effort into finding Amber until 2 years after her disappearance, when they did something unprecedented. They released this audio recording and asked anyone who recognized this man's voice to come forward.
Yo, we're not going in the city, are we? No, we're not. Then what are these roads going to? 50th Street. 50th Street. Are you sure? Absolutely.
My baby sounds so scared. And Amber was like a tough girl. She can take care of herself, And she won't just let anybody do anything to her without a fight or whatever. And I get nightmares. I have all these awful thoughts of what could have, what would have happened to her.
As hard as it is to imagine what happened, Tootsie can't let it go. Until Amber's killer is caught, she vows she won't give up.
And as messed up as it is, I think of the voice all the time. I think about the voice all the time. It's kind of like so messed up because Amber's case is about the voice, the man's voice. And now I am Amber's voice.
Now, her only hope is that someone out there recognizes the voice and has the courage to speak up. Connie Walker, CBC News, Fort Chipewyan, Alberta.
Unfortunately, Amber's case is still unsolved, and police are still looking for the man in that recording. I remember spending that time with her mother, Tootsie, in Fort Chipewyan, and feeling grateful to help raise awareness about Amber's case, but also frustrated because although, we were finally being able to tell the stories in a way that we felt respected family members and amplified their voices. In news stories, it was really difficult, and I'm sure you all struggle with this as well, difficult to provide the context that is needed to understand Amber's story, but really all of the stories. That changed after we got a tip about Alberta Williams' unsolved murder. Alberta was 24 years old when she was found off of the Highway of Tears in northern British Columbia in 1989. It was actually just, a little while after we launched the database of unsolved cases of MMIW. I remember I was sitting at my desk in Toronto and I got an email and the subject line said Alberta Williams murder. And I clicked it open and it was just one sentence. It said, Alberta was murdered by, and then it named a person. And I didn't know who had sent the email, but I wrote back right away, and it turns out the email was written by a former RCMP officer who was also the lead investigator in Alberta's unsolved murder. He always felt her case could be solved. He was adamant that he knew who was responsible. And he decided to reach out. And that email sparked a months-long investigation and led to the creation of our podcast, Missing and Murdered, Who Killed Alberta Williams? I remember I was writing episode 4 of that podcast when I just happened to attend a conference similar to this one in Regina. And it was called Reconciliation in the Media. And it was put on by Indigenous journalists in Saskatchewan following the death of Colton Boushie. And I remember I was a little bit stressed out because we were only a few weeks away from launch, and I was really worried that I couldn't afford to take a day away to attend the conference, but I'm so incredibly glad that I did, because what I learned that day changed the way that I do my job, and it changed the way that I report on all Indigenous issues. And it's a lesson that I think will be particularly relevant to you all and the work that you do. One of the keynote speakers you saw her photo that day was Dr. Marie Wilson, who was also one of the commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. She was also a former journalist who spent years reporting in the North. And as a former journalist, she understood the pressures that journalists are under in daily news. But I remember I was sitting like front row center when she delivered her keynote, and I felt like she was talking just to me. And what I really felt like she was doing was giving us all shit that day and saying, you're not doing a good enough job covering stories about Indigenous communities. She said, don't skip the context. That's the biggest trap I know for all working journalists when time is of the essence. If you can't explain it in this story, explain it in the follow-up. When did this story actually begin? And as I was listening to her, I was thinking about Alberta Williams and the podcast we were making, and I was thinking about when did Alberta's story begin? It wasn't with her death in 1989. In a way, it wasn't even with her birth. Her story and every MMIW story that I've ever covered began long before that. It began with a part of our history that many people still don't know. They began with the 60 Scoop, with residential schools, with the Indian Act, with colonization. Marie Wilson said it was our job as journalists to connect the dots, to provide that context, to help people understand the truth about our shared history, that despite my own lived experiences as a Cree woman, I didn't really know or understand. I finished writing episode 4 after hearing Marie's words, and we included the history and legacies of residential schools in Canada, and we used some of the voices and testimonies played at that final TRC event in Ottawa from 2015. The skeleton of our podcast was still focused on the mystery of Alberta's unsolved murder, but we also used the podcast to explain the history of the relationship between the RCMP and Indigenous communities. We told our audiences how the RCMP were often the ones who took children from their families and communities and sent them to residential schools, or how when children ran away from residential schools, it was often the RCMP that found them and forced them to return. And we explained how that mistrust could lead people not wanting to cooperate with police during Alberta's murder investigation, to explain why decades later, people who had never spoken to the RCMP were willing to talk to us about what they had seen the weekend that Alberta was killed. And after listening to 9 episodes of our podcast about Alberta, the number one feedback that we got from people was that they really appreciated us connecting those dots. We heard from people who said they had no idea this ever happened in Canada. But we also heard from people who said they thought they understood residential schools, but after listening, they came away with a different and deeper understanding. Even people who worked with Indigenous communities every day, social workers, child welfare workers, healthcare workers. So when we set out to do season 2 of our podcast, that was in the front of our mind, including the context, and it became essential to all of the stories we do. It was so important for us to help people understand what Alberta, what Cleo, what Jermaine, what Pamela went through in their lives, to create space for empathy for all of them. And in a podcast, we finally had space to do it. It wasn't long after that I started being supported to focus on stories from our communities. And I could see so many things were changing, not just in my world. So many people were coming forward and telling stories from Indigenous communities, stories big and small that pushed us forward and started conversations long overdue in this country. And then in May of 2021, a terrible discovery that, as one elder told me, woke up the world. The remains of what was believed to be children were found at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. It shocked Canadians and people around the world. And I'm sure you all remember that time. It was such a sensitive and raw time. And I think because, it felt like for the first time maybe, people were starting to finally pay attention, to open their minds and begin to understand what survivors had been saying for years and decades. I remember, seeing family members of mine make posts on social media about their time in residential schools. People who I'd never, ever seen speak about it before finally felt safe enough to publicly come forward and share some of their stories. And I remember one day I was scrolling through Facebook when I read a post that just stopped me in my tracks, because it was written by my brother, Hal Cameron, and it was about our father, our late dad, Howard Cameron. Hal said that our dad once told him a story about when he was an RCMP officer in rural Saskatchewan in the late 1970s. One night while out on patrol, he saw a vehicle swerving, so he pulled it over because he suspected the driver had been drinking. And when he got to the window, he realized that he recognized the driver as a priest who had abused him when he was a boy at residential school. Hal said our dad beat up the priest that night on the side of the road. He expected there to be a call to his commanding officer that his career would be over, but nothing happened. And it just became a story that my dad shared with my brother and that my brother eventually shared on Facebook. Hal told me that he felt pride when he thought of that story, proud that our dad was able to exact some form of justice for what he went through as a boy in residential school. But when I read that post, I felt ill. I read it again and again. I had never heard this story about my dad before. I knew that he had gone to a residential school, but that was it. I didn't know where he went or for how long, and I never knew that he had been sexually abused by a priest. And given what I knew about residential schools from my reporting, maybe I shouldn't have been surprised by that revelation, but I was. It broke my heart and it made me angry because I didn't think about my dad, the police officer who beat up the priest on the side of the road. I thought about the little boy that he was at residential school. And I couldn't stop thinking about him. I tried. In the days and weeks after reading it, I tried my best to just put it out of my mind, to push it away. But it kept coming back. I had so many questions about my dad. How did what happened to him at that residential school affect the father that he was to me? That's me, I'm the baby in the middle. That's my mom and my dad. I wasn't close to my dad. My parents split up when I was about 7 years old. And I think what I remember feeling at the time was mostly relief, because the dad that I remember was angry and violent. And the memories that I have of him from my childhood kept me at a distance from him my whole life. But hearing this story made me want to get closer and to understand him better. Part of the work I've been doing about reporting on Indigenous issues and missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls has also been learning about the impacts of trauma in our communities, about PTSD, and about healing from trauma. And one of the things that I've learned is that you can't outrun it. You try to, you spend a lot of time and energy trying to just push it away and not think about it, but then it always pops up. And one way to heal from it is to actually face it head on, to expose it, to shine a spotlight on it. So that's what I decided to do, investigate my dad's story, because even though I had spent years reporting on residential schools and the intergenerational effects, I didn't even know my own story. I'd never connected the dots in my own life and in my own family. So I decided to investigate the residential school that my dad went to and to see if I could find the priest who had abused my dad. I'm going to play the trailer for our podcast, just a snip of the trailer of our podcast for those of you who haven't heard it, just so you can get a sense of what it sounds like. Oh. Let's see if that works. Maybe it won't. Oh, I think sorry, I thought I had added a slide. I don't know if anyone. Okay, I won't play the trailer, but you can find it. It's available on actually anywhere you get your podcasts. And you can listen to more than the trailer. The whole podcast is out now. My father passed away in 2013, so I couldn't ask him directly about his experience at St. Michael's, but he was one of 15 siblings in his family who was sent to the St. Michael's Indian Residential School in Duck Lake. His brothers and sisters were there with him at residential school, and it could help me understand what life was like at that school for my dad. I interviewed several of my dad's siblings, and despite the fact that they were often really long and intense and sometimes heavy conversations, there was also always a lot of laughter. And after each one, we somehow felt lighter. I was so grateful to my family for sharing their stories, not just trusting me with their experiences at St. Michael's, but the gifts they gave me and in their memories and stories of my dad and helping me to get to know him in a different way and our family. And I also started learning about life at the St. Michael's Indian Residential School. It was open for over 100 years, and it was run by a Catholic order of priests called the Oblates of Mary Immaculate. The Oblates handed over their archives to the provincial archives. Oh, this is the trailer. Okay, I'm just going to skip it. Sorry, guys. The Oblates handed over their archives to the provincial archives in Alberta, so I went there. And I found my dad's admission form. He was sent to St. Michael's when he was 6 years old. I also found records of both of his parents and their parents, Nimushum Leo Cameron, who's my dad's, that's my mushum, Leo Cameron. He attended for 8 years in 1930. And his father, my chapan or great-grandfather, Jean-Baptiste Cameron, was student number 68 in 1900. 4 generations of my family went to this school before it closed in 1997. But none of us had ever seen these records before. There were hundreds of photographs of the school, of the children who attended. There were attendance records. There were school newsletters. At the bottom right-hand corner there is actually a booklet with each child's name and the number they were assigned when they went to St. Michael's. I photographed as much as I could in the days that I was there and shared some of these images on Facebook for my family and community to see, but so much remained hidden. I was looking for the priest who abused my dad, and in interviews with my relatives, I started hearing the names of some of the priests who had been accused of abuse at the school. And so I asked if I could see their personnel files in the Oblate archives, but I was told that they're sealed until 50 years after a priest's death. But I was able to access some information about the priests, and in one of the folders of a priest called Father Duhame, there were some mementos and postcards and things, and there was also some negatives in his folder. And I held them up to the light, and I could see that there were pictures of boys undressing in a locker room in his folder. It just made me want to learn more about St. Michael's, because even though there were hundreds of photos and thousands of documents, I knew that this wasn't telling the full story of this school. I wanted to find out what was missing from those archives. So we decided to broaden the scope of our investigation to try to talk to other survivors from St. Michael's. This personal story about my dad's experience was about to become much bigger. I wanted to understand what all children went through at this one single school and to create space for survivors to be heard. We ended up interviewing 28 survivors for our podcast, and episode 4 is a piece of oral history, just survivor voices and myself and another reporter that from Saskatchewan, Betty Ann Adam, talking about their lives and experiences. All of the voices, I'm going to play a clip from that episode. All of the voices and all of the photos that you're going to see are from St. Michael's, this one single school in Saskatchewan. Do you remember your life before residential school? Like, what was it like for you at home?
I remember a very happy life.
I remember living with my mom and my mushroom in Kokum. Never, ever did they lay a hand on me. I used to sleep with my Kokum.
Our mushroom had to get up early in the morning, and he'd make fire. And me and my sister Almeida would go running to our Kokum, just like she was just a heater, eh? She was so nice and warm. Mm-hmm. We'd go snuggle on either side of her while our mushroom went out.
I was so used to getting up in the morning, running outside, playing with my dog, going down to watch the boats go out in the lake, going to visit my grandparents, and all that was taken away.
Do you remember your first memory of St. Michael's? Like, do you remember what you felt like when you first went there?
Oh yeah, they picked us up here in a truck in Sturgeon Lake. It was kind of a cattle truck, and they loaded us up. My mom was crying. My dad was turning away, didn't want to look at us being herded in. There was an RCMP officer, a priest, and the Indian agent. And they told my parents they have to go to a Catholic school in St. Michael's, and if you don't send them to school, you will end up in jail. That's what they told our parents. And the priest says, we will look after your children, we will love your children. I will be the father to your children, and we have nuns and sisters in school over there. They will be the mothers of your children.
If you guys listen to any podcast that I have ever made, please make it episode 4 of Surviving St. Michael's, Not a Place to Be, because these survivors, I'm so grateful to them for sharing their stories with us, and they deserve to be heard and acknowledged. In those interviews with survivors, we heard multiple allegations of sexual abuse against several priests, nuns, and staff members at the school. And what started as this investigation to find my father's abuser became much bigger. We wanted to, for the first time, understand as much truth as we could about this one school and publicly name as many alleged abusers as we could. Now, I'm sure you're all aware that there was a residential school settlement, the Indian residential school settlement, and as part of the settlement, there was a process for survivors who experienced abuse at residential schools to receive additional compensation. It was called the IAP, Independent Assessment Process. More than 26,000 survivors went through the IAP. They reported thousands of crimes that were committed against them as children, but no one was ever charged through the IAP because it wasn't a criminal process. It was only designed to offer financial compensation. And all of the findings and all of the information from the IAP has never been made public. To this day, IAP records are sealed to protect the privacy of survivors, but as a result, the privacy of alleged abusers has been protected too. We couldn't see the IAP records, and actually no one will ever see them. Although they're the most comprehensive accounting of abuse at every residential school across the country, they're all hidden, and by order of the Supreme Court, they're going to be destroyed in less than 3 years, September 19th, 2027. So we couldn't see the IAP records of St. Michael's, but then we had another idea. For many of the survivors, the IAP wasn't the first time they told their stories. Thousands of them had done it years before when they sued the government and the churches for the abuse they experienced in residential schools. It's what led to the residential school settlement. We thought if we could find those lawsuits, we could have a better sense of what happened at St. Michael's. So we set out to find the lawsuits of survivors, and in the end, we were able to access about 500 lawsuits from this one school. Lawsuits against the government and the oblates, and what this investigation also turned into a data project. And our investigation uncovered more than 220 allegations of sexual abuse against 17 oblate priests at St. Michael's, 15 staff members, and 13 nuns. The majority of these alleged abusers had more than one allegation against them. And in many cases, the allegations didn't refer to a single incident, but abuse that occurred over months and even years. We found that many of these alleged abusers stayed with the church their entire careers. They moved around and went to different schools and communities. One of the priests that we heard about in my very first interview with family members was a priest named Father Gilles Gauthier, because my uncle Ivan accused him of sexually abusing him when he was a child at St. Michael's. And when I asked the Oblates about Father Gauthier, Father Ken Thorson, who speaks for the Oblates in Canada, wrote me back and said that he had never heard of any allegations against Father Gilles Gauthier. We wrote back again and asked for more information, and he said, I've asked around and nobody has ever heard of any allegations against Father Gauthier. And then when we found those lawsuits, I sent them the lawsuit my uncle Ivan filed, where he alleged that Father Gauthier sexually abused and raped him for years at St. Michael's. Then the Oblates did a review of their legal records and found that Father Gilles Gauthier had been credibly accused of sexually abusing 16 children at 3 different residential schools. As far as we know, there hasn't been a single nun or oblate priest who has ever been charged for a crime relating to this one school. Now, this is just one investigation into one residential school. There were over 130 across the country. It's been a couple years, honestly, since we published this, but I'm still processing what we uncovered, and what I'm left with is anger. This is the truth of this school, of our province, of our country. This is what's affecting every single Indigenous person you meet in your work. This is the context we all need to understand and share. And how can it be only now in 2022 that we're uncovering this? The window to document this truth is shrinking, and the window for accountability is also shrinking. We're all still living with the effects of residential schools, and our families and our communities deserve to know the truth. Canadians deserve to know the truth, and we all need to do what we can to preserve it before we can talk about meaningful reconciliation. Because my family is not unique. This started as a story about me and my dad, but after we published the podcast, I heard from so many other intergenerational survivors who said it felt like it was their story. People across the province and across the country who said that listening to this story about me and my dad reminded them of their moms or dads or kookums or mushums. What Justice Sinclair said that day here in Ottawa is true. Every single Indigenous person you encounter in your work has a family story and history like mine. I didn't get all of the answers to all of the questions that I had about my dad, but what I came away with was a more complete understanding of what he went through and how it shaped his life. After he left residential school, my dad struggled for a lot of years, but he kept going. And he eventually reconnected with his culture, he reclaimed his language and connection to the spirituality that they tried to take from him. He became an incredible father and grandfather and cultural leader in our community. And I feel like I got to know that part of him that I missed out on because of residential school through this podcast. And I came away with a deeper understanding of who my dad was. I'm so grateful for that opportunity, grateful to know more of the truth about my dad and all of the survivors in my family, because it's their strength and resilience and their ability to persevere and to take back what was stolen that has preserved so much love and beauty and connection in our families and in our communities. I want to give the last word today to the survivors of St. Michael's who shared their story with us. The first voice you're going to hear in this last clip is actually my auntie, Cookie Esperance, who initially, when I asked her if she wanted to be interviewed for the podcast, was kind of waffling a little bit. She said, "I'll think about it, I'm not sure." And then I was in my office one day in Toronto and I got a phone call from her, and she had just heard former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien on the news talking about how he didn't know anything about residential schools when he was the Minister of Indian Affairs, but he went to boarding school and it wasn't too bad, not great food, but it was okay. And she was so upset with the way that he spoke about residential school because she knew the truth of what she lived through and she knew the truth of what all survivors lived through. And so I want to give the last word to them today.
I know what happened. I lived it. Makes me mad. For all the years, my growing up years that were taken away from me, brutally, when I should have had those memories.
When I think of it, it's sad memories. When I think of it.
Has there been anything that has helped you to heal?
My sweat lodge.
Sometimes we cry for each other. We don't sit there and share tears because we're crying for ourselves. It's for each other. Like, who has been held accountable for the things that they have done to us? Nobody.
Is there any way for justice?
No, the only justice I got out of that was the way I treated my kids. I've never hit my kids, never. I hugged and kissed my kids and told them I loved them. And we raised them right. That's the only injustice I got, was the way I loved my kids so much.
I just love ending on that last clip of Frank Badger talking about how much he loved his kids and how that was, justice for him. Because I felt that too, like in spite of the fact that, I was raised with residential school survivors on both sides of my family, they showed me so much love and so much, taught me the importance of family and community, and there's so much beauty in our families and our communities, and I'm so grateful to all of them for preserving that for us, and thankful to you all for inviting me here today and for listening to me speak. I really appreciate it. Thank you. No, thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. So nice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Sessions will be starting. If you could allow those with accessibility needs to make room for them first, and enjoy the afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much.